All right. Well, maybe some other people trickle in, but it is 10 after, so I think this is on. Yeah. We're going to go ahead and get started. Let's start with the prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have to come together and study of your word. Pray that you be with those that are still on their way, that they might arrive safely, and be with those that are sick or traveling and not able to be with us. I know that Elaine and Andrea, they're traveling. Keep them safe on their travels. And just help us to have clear minds and hearts as we enter into this time of study. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right, we're studying, as you know, the themes of Daniel. And the next theme we're going to be studying comes from chapter 7. So let's be opening to Daniel chapter 7. I will be honest with you, we are going to be looking at some text we looked at previously when we looked at the character of Daniel, and I believe at least the context of this one is one of them. And I'm also going to be honest about the fact that in some of these cases we are going to get bogged down in the details because it's important to what we're studying in some of these things. But chapter 7, this chapter opens with Daniel saying, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. So verse 1 is one of those stage-setting verses, but what are we told here in verse 1? What's the situation? Okay, what does he do with the dream? He wrote it down, and he goes on to say that he gives a summary of it. Now, when did this occur, according to this verse? It's first year of King Belshazzar. It might be pronounced Belshazzar. I'm not sure. I'm not good on my pronunciation of some of these. Of King B. There you go. So that's the main thing. This is a historical time frame of when this dream occurred that Daniel wrote it down. From a historical standpoint, this is roughly around the year 553 BC. Now, as far as Belshazzar is concerned, he was the son of a king named Nabonidus, and probably the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar is no longer in power in this particular circumstance, but it's a historical setting for this dream that he's going to relate. Anything else on verse 1? Dream situations that have gone on before has been Daniel interpreting somebody else's dream. Right. And this is Daniel basically having to interpret his own. Right. Yeah, that's true. That's a good observation to make, that Daniel does interpret other people's dreams, mainly kings, but now he's having a vision and dream of his own that he's looking into. Anything else on verse 1? Okay. So verse 2, Daniel tells us what he's seeing, and this is occurring at night, and this is a dream, and those terms, I should say that those terms are sometimes used interchangeably, dream and vision. Because sometimes these visions do consist of what we would call dreams. But anyway, verse 2, the text says, Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. So, as we see in the text, in this verse, Daniel is recording that among the things he saw in his vision was what the text calls the four winds of heaven, which were stirring up the great sea. Now, when you read the Bible, when you run into that term, the Great Sea, in some context, it's the Mediterranean Sea, just by the land of Israel. But in other contexts, that language of the Great Sea sometimes refers to humanity. Now, one thing we know is there's a lot of people on the earth. And because that's true, sometimes the Bible uses that language of a sea. We're like a sea, we're an ocean of people all around the world. Now, one reason we know this is because one of those passages where we see this term, the Great Sea, being used in that way is Isaiah 57, verse 20. That's just one example where humankind is pictured as a sea. But that's not the only terminology we have here. We also have this phrase, the four winds of heaven. Now, when we think of heaven, who's there? God. So this phrase, four winds of heaven, has something to do with God, and it seems to be a reference to God's judgment coming down on humanity and carrying out his judgment through the rest of what Daniel's vision goes on to discuss. God's doing something is the idea here. Questions or comments on verse 2? Okay. So verse 3, text goes on, and Daniel says, and four great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. So just by way of review, what's the Great Sea? That's the amount of people. That's what we just discussed, it's humanity. So what's coming out of this Great Sea, according to the text of this verse? Four great beasts. And they're all different from each other. So out of humanity, these beasts are coming. And we're going to look at these beasts here in just a few moments. Now, these beasts, as context will bear out, what these beasts represent are four different kingdoms and empires that have come up from the Great Sea of humanity in human history. So, questions or comments on verse 3? Okay. So, verses 1 through 3 set the stage for this next theme of Daniel that we're going to be studying from verses 4 through 8. Another theme of Daniel that we see in this book is the theme of kingdoms and empires. The primary four of which are represented by the four great beasts Daniel describes in his vision. And so, since there is mention of these four great beasts, what we have in verses 4 through 8 are 4 points about which kingdoms and empires these beasts represent. Now, the first point we'll examine from verse 4 is that Daniel speaks of the Babylonian Empire. The second point we'll examine from verse 5 is that Daniel speaks of the Persian Empire, or also known as the Medo-Persian Empire. Third point we'll examine from verse 6 is that Daniel speaks of the Greek Empire. And finally, the fourth point we'll examine from verses 7 and 8 is that Daniel speaks of the Roman Empire. And again, those are all represented by these great beasts that Daniel describes. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and read verses 4 through 8, and then we'll look at these points, more specifically at these beasts. So Daniel chapter 7, verse 4, the text says, "The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind was also given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear. And it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying, and extremely strong. And it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boast. So there is a lot of information here, but these are 4 different beasts, 4 different points here in Daniel 7. But we're asking the question, who or what do these beasts represent? They represent different empires that have been seen throughout history. First, the Babylonian Empire, the first beast. Now, according to verse 4, what does the first beast look like in that first part of the verse? A lion with eagle wings. What's that, Cindy? Yeah, we might see something like this in horror movies, but this is what Daniel's seeing. A lion with an eagle's wings. So as we see that in the text. It was a lion that had wings like of an eagle. Now, with that in mind, one thing we should understand here is that the description Daniel gives of this beast is one that we find in other passages that describe Babylon. That's who this empire represents. Now, one such passage is Jeremiah 50, verse 17, where Nebuchadnezzar is described as a lion. He had driven the nation of Israel out, and he caused them to be a scattered flock. That's what we read in Jeremiah 50, verse 17. Another passage where Babylon is described as an eagle is Jeremiah 49, verse 22, where God is pictured as working through Babylon, carrying out his judgment on his people, and as an eagle that mounts up and swoops like an eagle. But this is there you go. I almost said leopard, that's later. This is a lion-like, or an eagle-like lion, as what we're seeing here. But one question we have to ask is, why is Babylon pictured in this way? One possible reason is because archaeological evidence that's been found of Babylon is that they have found statues of winged lions that are believed to have been representative of the Babylonian Empire. Again, that's just some historical information. But the text doesn't stop there. What happens to this eagle-like lion? Has its wings torn off. Now, that goes on from there, but let's just pause on that thought. If its wings are torn off, what's being done to Babylon? Okay, it's being grounded. Now, explain that a little bit, Deb. It's unable to fly, but as far as its power is concerned, what's being done? It's lessened. It's lost some of its power. But then what happens? Okay, so that's the part of the picture that's being painted here, is for a time it loses its power, but then it regains its power. Now, who's the first ruler of Babylon that we read about here in the book of Daniel? Nebuchadnezzar. Now, one of the things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar was he lost his power for a time. We read about that in Daniel chapter 4, where he'd been in power, but then he basically went insane, ate with the animals, but then he got his power back. That seems to be what Daniel might have in mind here. And I do say might. Because Nebuchadnezzar had lost his mind, and that was all part of the judgment, but then he got his mind back. And that seems to be part of the picture that is painted here in verse 4 of chapter 7, that this beast, he's no longer a beast, but he becomes humans. And that's what the picture that verse 4 is painting here. Questions or comments? Okay. I know this is a lot of information, but the point we should see from verse 4 about world kingdoms and empires in the book of Daniel is that Daniel speaks of the Babylonian Empire. There's a lot of references to it. in this book. But here it's pictured as a winged lion that underwent a transformation that caused it to become human. Now again, that's an appropriate description of the Babylonian Empire, because under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon underwent a transformation where it became less like a wild animal and more like a human being that cared about others. Now, I mentioned in a previous class that of the 4 empires we're going to be looking at, Babylon was the most moral. That didn't mean that they were moral. It just means in terms of morality, it was probably the best of the 4 that we're going to be looking at, because its ruler was more caring, and a lot of that, the reason for that is because of Nebuchadnezzar's relationship with Daniel. All right, let's go to verse 5. The second beast, the second point that represents the Persian Empire. So this vision of Daniel, it's continuing. What's the second beast he sees? A bear. Or more specifically, the text says one that looks like a bear. Now, what do we know about bears? They're powerful, large animals. That's true. That is true. And that's part of the idea and why this image of the bear comes up. It's very fierce as well. Now this represents the Persian Empire, so we have to ask, well, why use a bear to represent the Persian Empire? The reason for that is because a lot of the things we know to be true about a bear, in terms of its power, was also true of the Persian Empire. It was a large empire, it was a very powerful empire, and it was very fierce in battle. And we're going to see that in this continued description of the bear in this verse. So here in this verse, what else are we told about this bear? What does the text say? Okay, we'll get to what it's told here in a minute, but yes, we find another description of this bear. And yes, it's sandy red. It was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were between its teeth. Now, when something is raised up, what does that mean? Raised up. What does that mean? I'd say standing up, but also lifted up. So it's this bear, and let's just picture a literal bear, and one side of it's up. So, but we're asking, well, what does that represent? Now, this is all part of that Persian Empire. Now, one thing we know about the Persian Empire is it actually consisted of 2 different kingdoms, the kingdoms of Media and Persia. So it became known as the Medo-Persian Empire. Of those 2 empires, Persia was the more powerful of the 2. And so that seems to be what this raised up language has to do with, that it represents that one of the 2 empires that this empire consisted of was more powerful. Now, we read more about that in Daniel chapter 8, verse 20, where we find similar images here. But then we come into this 3 ribs between its teeth. So we're asking, well, what does that mean? What does that have to do with? This 3 ribs seems to represent that the fact that from history we know that the Medo-Persian Empire conquered 3 major kingdoms. Now, it conquered a lot more than that, but of all that it conquered, the 3 primary ones were the kingdoms of Babylon, number 1, and there's another kingdom named Lydia, and also Egypt. That seems to be what these 3 ribs have to do with, that it ate something. And in terms of the empire, those 3 kingdoms that I just mentioned. But then it's told to do something. What is it told to do? What's that? Is that what your translation says? devour much meat. What does that mean? Keep conquering more. Go out and kill. That's the language of it. So it's being allowed to continue exercising its power. Now, as applying that to the Medo-Persian Empire, is God was allowing the Medo-Persian Empire, at least for a time, to go out and continuing conquering as many nations as it could. So since that's true, what we should also understand is that at that point in history, we know that the Medo-Persian Empire was one of the largest empires of its time because it controlled more territory than any other empire up until that time. So that's verse 5. Questions or comments? All right. So the point we should see from verse 5 about world and kingdoms and empires in Daniel is that Daniel speaks of the Persian Empire, more specifically the Medo-Persian Empire. And here, as we've seen, it's pictured as a fierce bear that had parts of it that were more powerful than the other and was given permission to kill as much as it wanted to kill. So as a result, this bear that was the Medo-Persian Empire became one of the most powerful empires that history has ever known. So now we go to verse 6, the third beast. What's the third beast? Like a leopard. And what did it have? 4 wings of a bird. So that's the first 2 characteristics we see about this leopard. And it was another bird-like creature, similar to the lion. Now, what do we know about leopards? They are very fast. They're one of the fastest land animals that we know of, one of the fastest. But this one also had wings. Now, if you have a fast creature and you add wings to it, what happens? It becomes even faster. But this is representative of the Greek Empire. Now, since that's true, one thing we know about the Greek Empire, they were led, one of their first leaders was Alexander the Great. One thing that's true of Alexander the Great is he conquered other nations very quickly. And that seems to be why the Greek Empire is represented by this leopard who has wings, to represent the speed at which Alexander the Great conquered the places that he did up until his death at a very young age. So since that's true, what are the next 2 characteristics we find of this leopard? How many heads does it have? 4. And what is given to it? And what's dominion? Authority, rulership. So here Daniel is moving from the speed of this creature to the authority it possessed. Now, if this creature or beast is representative of Greece, what is said here refers to the fact that Greece possessed great authority, as evidenced in the fact that, like Babylon and Persia, it was also one of the greatest world powers that history has ever known. Now, as far as these 4 heads are concerned, these are representative of the fact that Alexander the Great died at the age of 32, and what happened after his death is that the Greek Empire was divided into 4 parts, and that's something we read more about in chapter 8 of Daniel. Any other questions or comments on verse 6? I got ahead of myself. Questions or comments on verse 6? All right. So putting that in the context of the themes of kingdoms and empires in the book of Daniel, is that Daniel speaks of the Greek Empire. Now here in verse 6, Daniel has drawn that picture of the Greek Empire, which is pictured as a leopard-like creature which had 4 wings and 4 heads that possessed great authority. Again, from a historical standpoint, this is one that is descriptive of Greece because of how great and powerful it became under the leadership of Alexander the Great until his death at the age of 32. But now let's go to the 4th beast in verses 7 and 8 that represents the Roman Empire. So this point is introduced in verse 7, not 6, verse 7, with that description of the 4th beast. It's a very detailed description. Now, what does this 4th beast look like? What are we told in verse 7 about it? It's dreadful, strong. Right. Right. That is one observation we need to make of this beast. Daniel does not compare it to an animal. He just sets it apart from the others. And he describes how powerful it is. Now, just one question from this verse. What did it do to the other 3 beasts? It devoured them, destroyed them. Now, this 4th beast is representative of the Roman Empire. Now, one thing that's true of the Roman Empire is that it replaced the previous 3 empires we've talked about as being the dominating world power of the time. Now, what we should also know here is that one reason Rome was the dominating world power is because of the 4 empires being referred to in these verses, Rome was the longest lasting. It lasted for approximately 503 years. The others didn't last that long. And it's said that it's lasted even longer because even today, we see the impacts of the Roman Empire, of what it's accomplished in world history. Now finally, before we leave this verse, one more thing we should understand is that something about these 10 horns. You have to ask, well, what are these 10 horns about? These are representative of 10 kings that ruled in the Roman Empire, and we see that in verse 24 of this chapter that we're not going to deal with today. Anything else on verse 7? All right. Verse 8. What happens in verse 8? Okay. So we have more details here. Daniel's thinking about these 10 horns. He's thinking, what are these 10 horns about? But as he's doing that, this 11th horn, as I'll call it, comes up. It's a smaller horn. And it has these human characteristics to it. It had eyes like the eyes of a man, a mouth uttering great boast. Well, what it does is it basically conquers 3 of the other 10 horns. Now, if the 10 horns are 10 kings, what this other horn is doing is conquering 3 of those 10 kings. Now, also based on verse 24 of this chapter, what eventually happens is that this little horn gains complete control over the Roman Empire that the 4th beast represents. Now, also verse 25 of this chapter indicates that this little horn is an individual who would bring great difficulty on God's people. Now, that's basically just a summarized version of what verse 8 is dealing with, but questions or comments? All right. So putting all this in that context of kingdoms and empires in Daniel, the point we should see here is that Daniel speaks of the Roman Empire. Now in these verses, Daniel's painted a very vivid picture of the Roman Empire through the presentation of this fourth beast. Now he's pictured the Roman Empire as a dreadful, terrifying, and powerful beast that would crush all those who attempted to fight against it. And ultimately this would be done under the leadership of this little horn of verse 8 that would be the most powerful of all the rulers in the Roman Empire. So when we consider everything that Daniel has recorded in verses 1 through 8 of this chapter, the point we should be left with is that Daniel speaks of kingdoms and empires. The book of Daniel, I mean. I did not come across that information. I would need to do a little more research on it. Let me see if I have anything here in my... Okay, I will say what some people have said. I don't agree with it. But some have said that this little horn represents that Antichrist that some people say is going to rule before the end of the world. Now, I don't agree with some of the theology behind that, but that's what some people have said, that it's that ultimate Antichrist. Jeremiah, you have something.
The concept, there was 12 different sects of religion about the first century. At the end of after, the Christian faith had split, and at that point, by the 3rd century, the Catholic Church became the only one. They destroyed all others.
Yeah.
They grew up out of all that. So that is also a common belief that it is the apostate church that would be destroyed and destroy everything for the time at that time.
Yeah. And then another passage where people get some of this is, I think it's 2 Thessalonians, the man of lawlessness, chapter 2, I believe. So what Jeremiah said is also true of this, just that it's this ultimate ruler. Some think it is the Catholic Church. So does that help you, Mom, with some of that? Yeah. So there's a lot of different ideas out there, but I don't have anything very specific about it. But if this fourth beast represents the Roman Empire, it's someone in the Roman Empire that would take complete control over the Roman Empire. I do believe it's already passed. Right. So, because the Roman Empire is gone. Good question, though. Anything else on verses 7 and 8 before we wrap up the section? All right. So, again, the 4 points we've looked at is that Daniel speaks of the Babylonian Empire, Daniel speaks of the Persian Empire, it speaks of the Greek Empire, and finally it speaks of the Roman Empire. So as far as application is concerned, what we should learn from these things is that we must learn to understand what Daniel says about kingdoms and empires in this book. Now, based on what we've studied in these verses, we should come to the realization that we need to understand something about the kingdoms and empires referenced in these verses. That does not mean you need to know everything about these 4 empires. What it does mean is that you have to have a general grasp on the history of these kingdoms if you're going to understand what Daniel says about them through these visions, like the one we've just examined. If we do that, then the result will be that we come to a greater knowledge of God's Word. Now again, that's just some application from what we've studied today. Any other questions or comments? All right. Jeremiah, will you close us today?